everyone, and welcome to this unit's micro lecture on theories of emotions. So when we talk about emotions, we're talking about the affective states, like happy, sad, all those types of things. You know what I'm talking about when I say emotions. But one thing I want you to differentiate when we talk about emotions versus temperament is that emotions are they're not a state, but they are dependent upon something. You know, sometimes when you wake up and you're just in a bad mood, that is not an emotion. An emotion is kind of like a direct effect of an event. So think of like a cause and effect kind of thing. An emotion is very like state dependent, whereas a temperament or a mood are kind of like an overarching, I don't want to say feeling, but a state. And you can't really link them to any one particular incident. So I think that's an important distinction to make before we talk about emotions. But we're going to explain the major theories of emotion, describe the role the limbic structures play in emotional processing, and understand the ubiquitous nature of producing, recognizing, and creating that emotional expression. So emotion versus mood. I started talking about this before we went in, but I want to give you strict definitions here that we're going to use for the purpose of this PowerPoint. But emotions are a subjective state of being that we often describe as our feelings, whereas a mood is a prolonged, less intense affective state that does not occur in response to something we experience. I would make sure you're able to differentiate those two. Now, when we talk about components of an emotion, we have a physiological arousal, psychological appraisal, and subjective experiences. I may need to reorder these, but we have subjective experiences in our life that may trigger us physiologically and psychologically. We may feel a certain way within our body, and we may assess that situation a certain way in our head. So when we talk about that physiological arousal, we may be talking about rapid heart rate. Right? Rapid heart rate. What are you feeling? What emotions are you feeling when your heart rate increases, right? Fear, nervousness, excitement. There are all different rates of emotions. So how do we determine, which emotion is a result of this physiological cue, this psychological appraisal, and this experience? Those are all dynamic factors that are going to come to play when we talk about emotions. And when we talk about psychological appraisal, we're talking about how we assess the situation. And this can be experienced by our background, our culture, our previous experiences. Maybe you had a bad experience public speaking one time. You almost passed out or something. That is an experience that you're going to take to heart, right? For that expression, you're going to carry it with you. So if you have another experience where you have to public speak, you may remember that previous experience and may appraise that psychologically as, ooh, that's not something I want to do, that's making me nervous. And then you have physiological arousal in your body as well, which can be shaking, feeling nauseous, maybe feeling like you have to use the bathroom, right? Those are all different things that come into our components of emotions. Now, I know these are numbered, but they're not like steps. They're dynamic. We don't know which one comes first, the physiological cue or the psychological appraisal. And that's what we're kind of going to look at with these theories of emotion that we're going to talk about in our text. When we talk about our feelings, do the feelings come first? Do we label them first, or do we have physiological cues first? So the example we're going to use across all of these theories is the example if we see a snake, if we're hiking in Goose Creek or something. I am not a nature person. So my fight or flight or freeze or fawn, my flight would be triggered and I'd be running, right? But we're going to talk about how it could relate to our processing of our emotions. So the James Lange theory states that emotions arise from physiological arousal, that we don't label them until we feel those physiological cues, and that's related to that fight or flight response in the autonomic nervous system, right? We experience emotions only after the arousal pattern, so our physiological cues kind of clue us in to how we're feeling according to James and Lange, which is interesting. sometimes it's hard because sometimes I like to think the emotion comes first, but could it be that our body has some perception we're not aware of and it's processing that situation before we can give that situation a name, before we can validate and kind of solidify our emotions? So here's the theory demonstrated. But as with the passage of time, you see a snake and you're walking in Goose Creek. That man is, I guess, scared. I don't know the face. But we have the arousal, which is the snake, which leads to that physiological change in our body, which then results in the emotion. We assess that and appraise it as the emotion of fear. Now, according to Cannon-Bard theory, this was a critique of the James Lange theory. And looking at, well, yeah, we're physiologically aroused when something happens concerning nature, seeing a snake, but we are physiologically aroused similarly across different emotional states. I may feel the same excited as I do nauseous. I may feel the same mad as I do, how does your body feel when you're mad? Mad as I do super excited. There may be similar feelings and physiological signals that are being sent that you can't differentiate. Your body can't differentiate without you appraising that emotion. So physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously in the Cannon-Bard theory. So it's not physiological first, like with James Lange. Cannon-Bard was saying that, hey, these things occur together, all right, but they're independent functions. So I think that's an important distinction. We have all these things happening, but they work independently. One is not as a result of another. It's kind of like the snake arouses both our psychological appraisal and physiological appraisal, but not as working together or reciprocating off of one another. I'm just skipping that slide for the sake of time to keep it condensed for the micro lecture format. But feel free to check it out because it does follow up on our reading. But the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion, which I'll be honest, if I had to pick one that I favored, it would probably be the Schachter-Singer model, just because I think appraisal is an important part of understanding our emotions. And this is saying that, we have that arousal factor. We have physiological cues and cognitive cues. So very much like the Cannon-Bard theory, right? Same components. But then we also have an additional step in that how we process arousal and fear, how we take that label that we've created for it and how we appraise it will then lead to the emotion. And lastly, this is kind of the cognitive mediation theory of emotion by Lazarus. It's kind of like what I thought happened with emotions before I learned any of the other theories. I thought it was just like you saw something, you had an emotion, and it made you feel some type of way. Which maybe in different situations it may feel like that. Like maybe we had an incident where we think of a horrible memory we have. We appraise that as, oh, that's so embarrassing, I don't want to think about it. And maybe it even makes us sick to our stomach. That may follow the Lazarus cognitive mediational theory. So we could probably think of examples in our life that are kind of anecdotes for each of these theories. So we can't really ascertain which one is more correct than others. Maybe which ones have more evidentiary support. But in this case, the appraisal is immediate and unconscious. We don't really have to think about what we're feeling. It's kind of like quick. And that's what leads to the physiological response. So it really comes, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And talking about the physiological kind of spurring of those emotional states or the emotional assessment, psychological factors. So make sure when you're reading, keep that in mind. What I've included on this next slide is a great review video from, once again, Hank Green, talking about feeling all the feels, and it's a good kind of summarization of these different points. So I would make sure you read your text and then consult this video. And let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week.